My mother handed everyone keys to luxury cars and Swiss watches while I sat there empty-handed. When she finally slid a single envelope across the table, she smirked and said, "This is all you deserve." I just gripped my fork and smiled because she had no idea that I had just signed the papers to evict her from this very house. My name is Audrey, I am 33 years old, and I am the black sheep of a family that worships money above blood. For years I played the role of the failure, the dropout, and the disappointment just to survive their toxicity. But this Christmas in Aspen was going to be different because this was the year the sheep became the wolf. We were gathered in the main dining hall of a $10 million chalet in Aspen, Colorado. Outside, a blizzard was burying the mountains in white, but inside the fire was roaring, and the room smelled of roasted duck and expensive perfume. My mother, Pamela, stood at the head of the table holding a champagne glass, looking like royalty in her velvet dress, but her eyes were cold as ice. She proposed a toast to my sister Brittany and her husband Damon for making the family name proud. I sat at the far end of the table wearing a sweater from Target, while Brittany was draped in Chanel. Pamela pulled out a Patek Philippe watch for Damon and a set of keys for a new Porsche Cayenne for Brittany. When it was finally my turn, there were no gold boxes or ribbons. Pamela reached behind a pile of gifts and pulled out a thin plain white business envelope that looked like a utility bill. She slid it across the mahogany table and it stopped right in front of my empty plate. She told me that since I quit medical school, they didn't think a lavish gift was appropriate, and that this suited my current lifestyle better. I tore the envelope open slowly and found it wasn't a check or a gift card. It was an invoice printed on my mother's personal stationery titled Vacation Cost Sharing Breakdown. It listed $400 for groceries, $200 for utilities, and $100 for cleaning fees, totaling $700. My mother sighed and said it was a lesson in accountability, because I had been unemployed for 2 years. Brittany even started live streaming my reaction to her friends on social media, mocking me for riding along for free. They waited for me to cry or beg, but they had no idea I had already rewritten the ending to their script. The room went silent as they waited for me to break. My mother, Pamela, leaned back in her chair, sipping her vintage champagne with a look of supreme satisfaction, while Brittany kept her phone camera pointed directly at my face. She was whispering into the microphone, telling her followers how awkward it was to have a sister who contributed nothing but expected everything. Damon, the arrogant corporate lawyer, checked his new Patek Philippe and cleared his throat. He opened his laptop with a sharp click and adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Actually, Pamela," he said, tapping away at his keyboard, "if we account for inflation and the current consumer price index in Aspen, that 700 figure is quite generous. I just ran a quick calculation based on square footage usage, and Audrey is occupying the guest suite, which is 15% of the total floor plan. Plus, she consumes approximately 3,000 calories of premium food daily." He turned the laptop screen toward me, showing a spreadsheet he had apparently prepared beforehand like a weapon. "Strictly speaking, Audrey, you actually owe us closer to $900, but we are family, so we are giving you a $200 discount as our Christmas gift to you." Brittany covered her mouth to hide a giggle, but her eyes were dancing with malicious delight. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but it wasn't from the shame they expected. It was a cold burning anger at the calculated cruelty of handing me a bill while they handed each other luxury cars. They thought I was broke because I lived a minimalist life and kept my finances hidden in offshore accounts they knew nothing about. They didn't know that the medical school I dropped out of was just a cover while I built a software empire that was now worth more than all of Pamela's real estate holdings combined. I did not get angry, and I did not shout. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light as I looked at the invoice and then at Damon's smug face. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. $700. Who should I send it to? Pamela blinked, surprised by my lack of emotion, and told me to transfer it to her personal account. I tapped my screen a few times, and a soft ding echoed from Pamela's purse on the floor. "Transaction complete," I said, sliding my phone back. But as I sat there, I wasn't just paying for dinner. I was sending a silent signal to my assistant to initiate the final phase of the acquisition. By the time the sun rose, my mother wouldn't just be richer by $700, she would be losing the very roof over her head. After the transaction notification cleared, Pamela's face tightened. She had expected a scene, but my calm compliance robbed her of the satisfaction of seeing me suffer. I sat through the rest of the dinner in a silence that they mistook for defeat. Brittany continued her live stream showing off her new Porsche keys and mocking the Target sweater I wore, while she bragged about her future plans for the family inheritance. She kept panning the camera back to me, hoping to catch a stray tear, but I just continued to cut my steak with surgical precision. When the dessert was served, I reached under the table and pulled out a small box I had brought with me. It was wrapped in matte black paper with no ribbon, no bow, and absolutely no card. It looked less like a Christmas present and more like a piece of evidence. I placed it in the center of the table, where it sat stark and unadorned against the crystal and silver. Brittany leaned forward, squinting at it with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She asked if it was a DIY craft project from therapy, or perhaps some homemade cookies. Damon let out a short barking laugh and suggested it might be coupons for free hugs. He grabbed the box and shook it violently next to his ear. It made no sound. Whatever is in here, he sneered, is definitely not in the same tax bracket as a Patek Philippe. He made a motion as if to toss it over his shoulder, but Pamela barked at him to put it down. She told me she would accept the gift with grace, regardless of its minimal value, but then she made an announcement that made the air in the room turn cold. She said that because of my lack of ambition, she had decided to officially move my share of the family trust into Brittany's name. She told me I would be staying in the guest quarters until the end of the week, after which I would need to find my own way back from Aspen. I didn't flinch. I told her that she should open the black box on New Year's Eve, because that was when the contents would be most relevant. Pamela rolled her eyes and told the staff to clear the plates, but then she turned to me with a smirk. Since you are so eager to pay your way, Audrey, you can help the staff scrub the pots tonight. It builds character for someone with no career. I watched them sweep out of the room toward their spa appointment, leaving me alone with the dirty dishes and the black box. I pulled out my phone and saw a message from my legal team. Phase 1 activated the bank, just notified Damon of a credit freeze. They have no idea what is coming. The heavy oak doors of the dining hall slammed shut behind my mother and sister, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt physical. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the wreckage of their expensive dinner, the half-eaten duck, the spilled wine, and the discarded gold wrapping paper. My mother had actually expected me to put on an apron and scrub the grease from the pans after she had just handed me a bill for my presents. But I didn't feel like a servant. I felt like a judge. I moved slowly through the room, gathering the dirty plates, but instead of heading to the kitchen, I sat back down at the head of the table in my mother's chair and opened my laptop. While they were at the Ritz-Carlton getting their massages and cucumber water, I was watching the digital world collapse around them. I had spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring the distressed debt of my mother's real estate company through a series of shell corporations. She thought she was still the queen of the New York market, but in reality, I owned the bank that held her mortgages. I watched the clock. At exactly midnight, the automated systems I had set in motion began to fire. I saw the alerts on my screen as the credit lines for Pamela's main properties were suspended. I saw the notifications as the corporate accounts for Brittany's lifestyle brand were flagged for an emergency audit due to the suspicious transfer of trust funds my mother had just mentioned at dinner. A few hours later, the front door burst open and the quiet of the chalet was shattered. I heard Damon's voice first, sounding frantic and stripped of all its usual corporate arrogance. He was in the foyer shouting into his phone about a credit freeze. I stayed in the shadows of the kitchen doorway as they swarmed into the living room. Damon was still in his spa robe, his face pale in the glow of his phone screen. He was telling Pamela that every single one of their joint credit cards had been declined at the hotel. The manager had to pull them aside in front of their socialite friends because the payment for their $3,000 treatment wouldn't go through. Brittany was pacing like a caged animal, her phone clutched to her chest as if it were a life support machine. She was crying about her brand account being frozen and how she couldn't pay her assistant or her publicist. Pamela was trying to maintain her composure, telling them it was just a technical glitch or a banking error, but I could see the tremor in her hands. They looked so small and fragile in that moment, stripped of the plastic and gold that gave them their power. I stepped out of the kitchen holding a single glass of water. They all froze, looking at me as if I were a ghost. I asked if the spa was relaxing, and the look of pure venom Pamela gave me was better than any gift I had ever received. Damon ignored me frantically, calling his bank again, only to be told that his accounts were under a legal hold. They had 48 hours of luxury left in this house, and they were spending the first 5 minutes of it realizing they were broke. The sun had barely risen over the snow-capped peaks of Aspen when I found Damon waiting for me in the kitchen. He was no longer the confident lawyer from the night before. He was wearing his cashmere robe and holding a mug of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The panic I had witnessed in the middle of the night had morphed into a desperate kind of aggression. He tried to corner me by the espresso machine, demanding to know if I had somehow messed with their accounts. He accused me of being a bitter dropout who was jealous of their success, but his eyes were darting around the room looking for an exit strategy. I simply smiled and told him that perhaps he should have spent less time calculating my calorie intake and more time reading the fine print on his firm's partnership agreements. By 10 a.m., the atmosphere in the chalet was toxic. Pamela was on the phone in the study screaming at her business manager while Brittany sat on the velvet sofa staring at her phone in horror. Her social media engagement was plummeting because her latest post about the Porsche had been flagged for copyright infringement by the rental company I had quietly contacted. They didn't even own the car yet, it was a lease-to-buy agreement that my company now controlled. Every luxury they flaunted was built on a foundation of sand, and I was the tide coming in. Pamela marched into the living room, her face a mask of calculated fury. She pointed a finger at me and told me that she didn't care what kind of games I was playing, but I was to leave the house immediately. She claimed that she was still the head of the Wilson family and that her lawyers would have everything restored by noon. I didn't move from my chair. I watched as Damon tried to use his prestige to call in favors from his old Ivy League friends, only to find that no one was picking up. The word was already spreading through the tight-knit circles of the elite that the Wilson empire was under investigation. The social capital they had spent decades building was vanishing faster than the morning mist. Brittany started screaming at me, calling me a parasite and a traitor, but her voice lacked its usual sting. She was realizing that without her mother's money, she was just a girl with a lot of expensive clothes and no actual skills. I looked at my mother, who was still standing over me, and I reached into my bag to pull out a folder of my own. I told her that she was right about one thing. Accountability is a powerful lesson. I explained that I hadn't just been finding myself during my time away from medical school. I had been studying her balance sheets. I had seen the predatory loans she took out to keep this very chalet, and I had seen how she manipulated Brittany's trust fund to pay off her own gambling debts in Macau. The color drained from Pamela's face as she realized I knew everything. I told her that the 48 hours I mentioned earlier weren't a suggestion, but a countdown. I wasn't the one who was leaving the house. They were. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. Pamela slumped into a chair, her regal posture finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. She tried to stammer a denial, saying I was hallucinating, and that she had never touched Brittany's trust. But I laid the forensic accounting reports on the table between us. I showed her the signatures, the wire transfers, and the exact dates when the money was moved to cover her losses. Brittany looked from the papers to our mother, her face twisting in a mask of realization. "You spent my money," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You told me Audrey was the one draining the family, and it was you." Damon tried to intervene, stepping forward with his chest puffed out, claiming that as a lawyer, he would have these documents thrown out of any court. He called them illegal recordings and privacy violations. I looked at him and reminded him that he was no longer a lawyer in any capacity that mattered. I informed him that his firm had been notified of his involvement in Pamela's shell companies 2 hours ago, and that they had already initiated the process of his termination. He wasn't just losing his credit cards, he was losing his license. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as the reality of his career ending began to sink in. I told them that the black box on the table contained the final deed of sale for this chalet. I explained that I didn't just buy their debt, I bought the ground they were standing on. My mother looked at me with a hatred so pure, it was almost beautiful. "You think you can just buy us out," she spat. "We are family, Audrey. You are a part of us whether you like it or not." I told her that she was the one who taught me that love was a transaction, and that I was simply closing the deal. I had spent years being the invisible failure, while they used me as a footstool for their egos, but the hierarchy had flipped. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the blizzard that was finally beginning to clear. I told them that the local sheriff was already aware of the eviction notice and that he would be arriving at sunset to ensure they left the premises peacefully. Brittany started crying again, but this time it wasn't for her followers, it was for herself. She asked where they were supposed to go, and I told her that was a question for a person who contributed something meaningful to society. I had already booked them 3 rooms at a budget motel by the airport. It was a far cry from the Ritz, but as my mother said at dinner, I thought it suited their new lifestyle better. The afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, casting long, cold shadows across the dining hall. The atmosphere inside the chalet was frantic and desperate. My mother was no longer the poised queen of the family, she was a woman possessed, throwing her designer silk scarves and crystal figurines into overpriced suitcases with trembling hands. Brittany was sitting on the floor in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by her Chanel bags and mountain of shoes, sobbing as she realized that no one was coming to save her. She had tried to call every friend on her list, but as soon as they heard the Wilson name was toxic, they had all hung up or blocked her. Damon was the worst of them all. He had moved from aggression to a pathetic state of begging. He followed me from room to room, pleading with me to reconsider and offering to work for my company as a legal consultant for free, if I would just help him keep his partnership. He talked about his reputation and his hard work, but I just kept walking. I reminded him of the spreadsheet he had shown me at dinner, the way he had calculated my calorie intake to humiliate me in front of the staff. I told him that in my world, loyalty and respect are the only currencies that matter, and he was completely bankrupt. At exactly 5:00, a dark SUV pulled into the driveway, and the local sheriff stepped out. He didn't come with sirens or handcuffs. He came with a clipboard and a firm expression. He knocked on the heavy oak door, and the sound echoed through the hollowed-out house like a funeral bell. I met him at the door and handed him the final ownership papers. He looked at my mother, who was standing at the top of the stairs, clutching a fur coat, and told her it was time to leave. The look on Pamela's face when she had to walk past the kitchen staff, she had treated like dirt, only to be escorted out by a man in a brown uniform, was something I will never forget. They had to drag their own bags through the slushy snow to the airport shuttle I had called for them. There was no Porsche, no chauffeur, and no golden ribbons. As they stood by the curb, waiting for the van, Brittany turned to me and asked how I could be so cruel to my own blood. I looked at her and then at my mother, who couldn't even meet my eyes. I told them that I wasn't being cruel, I was being the teacher they wanted me to be. I was giving them the lesson in accountability they had so eagerly tried to give me. I watched the shuttle pull away, leaving me alone in the $10 million silence of my new home. I walked back inside and picked up the black box from the table. It was empty because the real gift was the freedom I had just won. The chalet was finally quiet. I stood on the balcony of the master suite, watching the red taillights of the airport shuttle disappear into the white blur of the aspen night. The blizzard had returned, wrapping the world in a cold velvet silence that felt like peace. I walked back into the living room, where the fireplace was still flickering with the dying embers of the wood the staff had gathered earlier. I told the house manager and the remaining staff that they were all receiving a significant bonus for their patience during the transition, and that their jobs were secure under the new ownership. They looked at me not with the fear they had for my mother, but with a newfound respect for the woman they had once seen as the invisible failure. I didn't stay in Aspen to gloat. By the next morning, I had checked into a suite at the Ritz-Carlton just to see the contrast. As I sat in the lobby drinking my coffee, I watched the general manager hurry over to me. He bowed slightly and addressed me as Ms. Wilson, informing me that my private car was waiting at the main entrance and that my jet had been cleared for takeoff to Tokyo. I looked at my reflection in the polished marble walls, and I didn't see a victim of a toxic family or a dropout who had lost her way. I saw a victor. I saw a woman who had taken the black sheep label and turned it into a cloak of invisibility that allowed her to build an empire while her enemies were distracted by their own vanity. My mother and Brittany had arrived at the airport motel, and I heard through my assistants that they were already fighting over the last of their remaining cash. Pamela was trying to figure out how to spin the story to save her reputation, while Brittany was desperately trying to delete the live stream from the night before. But it was too late. The internet never forgets, and the world now knew them for exactly what they were. Damon was facing a long and public investigation into his financial dealings, and without the Wilson name to protect him, he was effectively erased from the legal community. They had spent their lives worshipping the aesthetics of wealth, but they had completely failed to understand the mechanics of power. I stepped into the back of my jet black Rolls-Royce Phantom and sank into the leather as the driver headed for the airport. I thought about the lesson my mother tried to teach me about the cost of a lifestyle. She was right, everything has a price. Her price was her family, her integrity, and her soul. My price was 3 years of silence and the strength to let them underestimate me until it was too late for them to fight back. As the jet climbed above the clouds, leaving Aspen and the broken Wilson legacy behind, I opened my laptop to begin the next acquisition. I had started as the outcast, but I ended as the owner. The black sheep was gone, and the wolf was finally home.